My name is Victoria Vardanega, and I will be talking to you today about South Korean press, specifically internet press, and how that's been affected by the historical context with which Korea has developed in the past 20th and 21st century. Okay, so fun fact, I'm actually wearing the same blazer as I am in that picture, so it's my good luck blazer, I guess you could say. Again, my name is Victoria Vardanega, and I hail from California. If anyone knows where Sacramento is, it's actually the capital of California. It's not Los Angeles or San Francisco. And I graduated from Pomona College with a double major in Asian Studies and Economics, and my Asian Studies focus was Korean history. Sorry, this is an unfamiliar clicker, but I just wanted to briefly kind of go in an outline about where I'm sort of taking you on our journey tonight in the next 40 to 45 minutes. So I will be talking about why did I specifically choose this topic, my research question, what is the historical background on the development of modern Korean press and internet, looking specifically at these two key events, Sewol, the sinking of the MV Sewol and the Inter-Korean Summit in 2018, specifically examining the effect of internet media bias. And then my conclusions and further study, because as Heidi mentioned, this is sort of preliminary. I obviously, I'm not going to be leaving next month for my end of my Fulbright grant. I will be here until early July. So I'm still working on things, and because this forum is more of sort of a Q&A, it's more open forum, I definitely would be very open to any constructive criticisms or thoughts on my research, because it's still a work in progress. Okay, so I'll just kind of briefly go into why I chose this particular topic. So as I mentioned earlier, I double majored in Asian Studies with an emphasis on Korean history. So when I was working on my thesis topic, which I chose to study specifically South Korea's economic development during the latter half of the 20th century under President Park Chung-hee. And so when I was looking at this particular topic, I noticed there was sort of a duality that existed in this economic development. You had South Korea, a country that was war-torn and devastated following the Japanese colonization and the Korean War, going from an aid-receiving country, a third world aid-receiving country, to becoming an OECD nation and developing into an economic Asian dragon or Asian tiger, and having a very esteemed reputation worldwide. But with this journey in economic development, you notice in your research you can notice kind of a duality that exists between this sort of proud memory of economic development and the sort of darkness that exists at the subaltern level. And what I mean by darkness is that in order to achieve the economic greatness that South Korea did, it had to suppress press freedoms as well as political freedoms and a lot of labor unionization. So in my thesis research, I was specifically looking at the duality of these historical memories. And I titled my thesis, Miracle on the Han River, which is a common moniker used to refer to South Korea's economic development, an analysis of the construction of historical narratives. And so with my engagement with this interest in this particular duality, I also became interested in South Korean press, because I thought that this duality was definitely reflected in the development of press, and this is something that I'll be going into in my presentation. And in addition to this, when I became interested in specifically internet press in South Korea, because I am a millennial, and being hooked on all the various social media and my computer and my phone, I definitely think that the internet plays a really important role in how we understand press and media today. And that's definitely a reason why I chose to sort of hone my topic to specifically look at the research question of how has the historical and cultural background of the development of South Korea's press been impacted by the onset of internet usage in the 21st century. Okay. So before I go into the historical background of my research topic, I sort of want to position myself within the literature that exists regarding press in Korea. So you have a lot of literature that exists regarding pre-democracy literature. So that's focusing on South Korea press and social freedoms prior to 1987. And so within that literature, you have a lot of focus on particularly Park Chung-hee, because during this time period of 1961 to 1979, you have him as the sort of main leader who unfortunately was suppressing a lot of political and social freedoms as a result. So there's a lot of literature that exists that's sort of emphasizing and focusing on that particular aspect. And in addition to that, you also have modern literature that looks at South Korean media, but it's looking at it from the perspective of sort of media in congruence with X themes. So for example, I read a few books, some being like media, South Korean media in conjunction with the development of Korean democracy, or South Korean media in conjunction with national security, or South Korea in conjunction with South Korean governance. So in sort of this way, I'm looking specifically at South Korean press practices, specific to internet press practices, and trying to situate this in historical context. So that's how I sort of position myself within this particular literature. Okay, so this is a brief history on South Korea's press. I will warn you that I am going from 1910 to the early 2000s, so I'll try to make this as concise as I can, but there's a lot of information, so if you have any questions or would like me to clarify anything, please feel free to raise your hand. I'd be more than happy to talk about it, because actually the first half is primarily my thesis, so I'm pretty familiar with this information. Okay. Sorry. Okay. So first, looking at the colonial era, so that's from 1910 to 1945, you have a divided press that exists within South Korea. And I think it's important to note, though, that this is particularly looking at sort of the political press, the division being the Japanese government-supported press, and the press that existed that was supporting the independence movement that was happening in South Korea under the Japanese colonial regime. But in addition to this sort of government-focused press media, you do have press newspapers that are trying to encourage short stories and the sort of preservation of Korean culture and those important avenues as well. So following 1945, the pre and post-Korean War era, it's important to note that South Korea press is sort of freed from its particular role in the division between Japanese and Korean independence focus, and then becomes a sort of a watchdog of the government, even able to criticize Lee Seung-man, who was the president during this time period. And this is important because it's a strong contrast to the later press practices that occur under President Park Chung-hee in 1961. And it's important to note the national security law, and this is something I'll touch upon later in my presentation as well. But this was enacted in 1948, and the purpose of it was to secure the security of the state and the subsistence and freedom of nationals by regulating any anticipated activities compromising the safety of the state. So in large part, this is mainly to sort of ensure the safety and security of South Korea, but it is primarily used in sort of any sort of relationship that entities or people have with North Korea. And later on, as you see the development of South Korea's democracy progresses, you notice that presidents and dictators alike tend to use this particular national security law as a means to justify imprisonment or the sort of the battlement of journalists and other activists. And then also it's important to note that following the Korean War, you have an influx of anti-socialist and communist sentiment, which makes sense, following the Korean War. South Korea fighting North Korea, a communist entity, in the presence of the United States in South Korea at this time period, you would then have more of an anti-socialist and communist sentiment. You then notice after 1960, with the student protests that led to the exit of Lee Seung-man, the president at the time, you have the military coup of Park Chung-hee in 1961, which leads to the Park Chung-hee era of the Park Chung-hee era. So I divide the Park Chung-hee era into pre-Yushin and post-Yushin. And so what I mean by Yushin is translated as rejuvenation or renewal. And this is specific to an addendum that President Park adds to the Constitution to essentially give him the opportunity to be a leader for life. And I'll go into the context for why he chooses to do this particular decision, but just note that the pre and the post-Yushin era do sort of demonstrate a shift in how the press and the government, Korean government, do interact. So looking at the pre-Yushin era, in 1963 specifically, President Park tries to enact the temporary emergency measures, which essentially is trying to regulate the press and state that because South Korea is in a time of national emergency, that it justifies the lessening of political and social freedoms. But this ultimately was panned by the global community, and then ultimately he had to sort of back down and dial back this particular edict. But then he was formally elected in 1963, and then he was able to push forward with the law concerning press ethics. And so essentially this law was a medium for which Park could curtail the freedom of expression of Korean press outlets. And so for specific example, the 4 dailies, the 조선일보, 동아일보, the 경향신문 and the 매일신문, they proved resistant to this specific acts. But Park threatened these newspapers with a lack of government subsidies and support and the threat of a drop in subscription bases. And so with that threat, these newspapers had no choice but to sort of comply to being an extension of a propaganda arm for the Park regime. And so some specific examples that sort of echo what I've just spoken about is the Gyeongyang Daily was actually forced to be sold in 1967, allegedly because it sort of embroiled itself in the controversy. With 1964, you had President Park Chung-hee initiate the Korean-Japanese Treaty, which resulted in exchange for Korea receiving a large amount of money from Japan, the sort of implicit understanding that Korea would not be able to sort of challenge Japan on any of the war atrocities that occurred under the colonial era from 1910 to 1945. And as we know, then this later comes to light in the 1990s with the bravery of the Wianbu, the comfort women grandmothers that come forward and talk about their experiences. In addition to this, you also have the editor of the Chosun-ilbo, who was sort of embroiled in taking money from the Park government, is also sort of encouraged to become silent and to not voice his opinions that were initially anti-Park. So then you notice then there's sort of a shift in which the press becomes a means of promoting economic development and sort of becomes an extension of this propaganda arm for the South Korean government. So following the Yushin Declaration, and so in 1972, essentially, Park Chung-hee and Kim Dae-jung had an election, and Kim Dae-jung narrowly lost. But after this, Park Chung-hee enacted Yushin, in which he essentially was given unlimited terms for re-election, and he would be only presented with the opportunity to be re-elected by a body called the National Conference for Unification, with members that were 1/3 appointed personally by himself. So he sort of guaranteed himself the opportunity to be able to be re-elected until he passed. So with this action of Yushin, he sort of continues to aggressively absorb the press into the state apparatus. And there was, during this time period, there is a really strong suppression of political and social freedoms, but there is one sort of key event of resistance I think is of note. It's the Donga Daily declared independence in 1974 from the sort of suppressive regime that Park Chung-hee had put under Yushin. And so in their bravery, they attempted to assert independence, but mysteriously their subscription base disappeared along with a lot of their ad revenue. So in order to try to support the Donga Daily and the stance that they were trying to strive for, many Korean people personally gave money to try to support this newspaper. But ultimately, this form of resistance failed, and the rebellious journalists and editors had to leave their position at the Donga Daily to be replaced by more pro-Park journalists. I think I'm getting the hang of the clicker, which is really good to see. And then so shifting and moving on to, and just a note, it's sort of, as you can see, this complete effect of where the South Korean press is sort of becoming this strong arm of propaganda for the South Korean government at this time. And then so we have with the dawn of democracy from 1979 to 1987. So following President Park's assassination in 1979, you have South Korea faced with much of the same treatment of the press with President Chun and his successor, President Roh Tae-woo. So Chun Doo-won, he enacts the basic press law. And this was actually originally instated in 1973 under Park Chung-hee, but it becomes formal guidelines for which the press operates in 1980. So maybe some of you know about the Gwangju massacre that occurred in 1980. So I think that you can definitely connect maybe the treatment of how the press dealt with that particular tragedy if you look at the context of the basic press law. For instance, under the basic press law, so it really restricts how the press can report specific incidents, and it covers a broad range of areas including national security, public order, national interest, and others. And under others, it specifically talks about the press not reporting activities of the military authorities under martial law. So then sort of you're able to kind of draw the conclusion that, you know, because of the basic press law, you probably had that additional restriction of South Korean press from being able to report the atrocities that occurred in 1980 in Gwangju. And in addition to this, an important thing to note is that during this time period, there was a major restructuring of the media under Chun Doo-won. So you had a merging of what originally was 28 newspapers in South Korea becoming 14, 29 broadcasters becoming 3, and 7 news agencies becoming 1. So as you see that major consolidation of all these different media organizations leads to sort of a centralization effect for Korean media, and then allows for the Korean government to be able to strongly control what sort of information is being disseminated under President Chun. And then another thing to note is that within that monopoly, that the 5 Korean national newspapers which were centered in Seoul had a really strong monopoly and sort of kind of grew their own strength. And so of the 5, the three that I think would be very notable and you probably recognize would be 조선일보, 동아일보, and the 중앙일보. And then to note the specific media shift in motivation as well, you sort of see initially what happened under President Park is you have the Korean media is sort of forced and strong-armed into becoming a government apparatus of propaganda. But then under Chun Doo-won, you see this sort of shift where media develops a sort of a profit-seeking entity, where it is trying to seek capital and essentially partner with the government in order to, in some ways, corruption through bribery and trying to get political and economic favors. So then following 1987 with the student protest that led to the democratization of South Korea, you then have a close election between Roh Tae-woo, Kim Yong-sam, Kim Dae-jung, and ironically, Roh Tae-woo won. And it's ironic because Roh Tae-woo was sort of the spiritual successor for Chun Doo-won, who was largely perceived as a really unpopular president. And so the reasoning behind how he won was that Kim Yong-sam and Kim Dae-jung sort of separated the liberal vote and sort of split the votes. And so in that way, Roh Tae-woo was considered successful. But even though under this particular president who was conservative and was sort of the spiritual successor of Chun Doo-won, you do have the proliferation of more press freedoms. And so what I mean by more press freedoms is that, you know, from this time period of 1961 to 1987, you had a primarily conservative block of media, and you had a primarily mainstream conservative newspaper and opinion that was proliferated throughout South Korea. And so during 1988, and with the onset of democracy in South Korea, you had the ability to share opinions that were different than the conservative mainstream. So for instance, I don't know, maybe some of you are familiar with Hangyeolhae, which is a more liberal newspaper in South Korea. It was established in 1988, following the democratization period. But it is important to note, though, that even though it was able to establish itself, it did have a clear disadvantage in its early years because of its liberal opinion, which was very against the grain of conservative mainstream media. And so it made it difficult to establish itself, but now I think it's very much considered a mainstream media conglomerate in South Korea. And I think to sort of illustrate the shift in difference of opinion is under Kim Yong-sam, you see a diversity of opinion that starts to be created under these different media conglomerates in South Korea, very much based on sort of political bias. So for an example for this is that when Kim Il-sung passed away, there were newspaper articles that came out about this, and the 조선일보, which is definitely more of a right-wing newspaper, stated, Kim Il-sung dies, people cheer. And then in contrast to this, you have the Hangyeolhae listing him as a key dialogue partner. So you sort of see that there is a difference in wording, which is kind of reflective of the political bias that each newspaper is carrying, their mainstream political bias. So it's important to note that with Kim Dae-jung, he's definitely perceived as a major human rights lawyer, and he definitely changed the environment of social political freedoms in South Korea as president. But he definitely alienated the mainstream conservative press. And he did this primarily through his tax evaluations of the big three media conglomerates. So I mentioned earlier that the big three media conglomerates were the 동아일보, the 조선일보, and the 중앙일보. And so they actually had 70% of the market share of media in South Korea during this time period. And so for him, he described this move as a means to try to break up this strong monopoly of conservative media being disseminated to Korean people. But the conservative media accused him of simply trying to attack them because he disagreed with their opinions, because they were critical of his education reform policy and his overtures of peace or communication with North Korea. So regardless of what was the truth and what was falsehood there was definitely a strong sense of tension between the government and the press, the liberal government and the conservative press of South Korea during this time. And then finally looking at Roh Woo-hyun, he furthers the sort of liberal antagonism with this conservative press with his establishment of the newspaper law and the press arbitration law, in which he essentially establishes a fund to help provincial newspapers encourage the dissemination of other opinions outside of just the mainstream conservative newspapers. But this is sort of controversial because he, again, like his predecessor, Kim Dae-jung, is sort of fixated on stopping the monopoly of these big three media conglomerates to be no more than 30%. So again, the conservative media that feels sort of attacked by this sort of opinion, and there is an increase in the tensions between the liberal government and the conservative media. And in addition, the arbitration law also encouraged corrections to information in papers upon request. So this was controversial because for conservative newspapers, they then could have reader bases or people report that there's something incorrect in the article and have it changed, but there could be controversy on whether this was due to simple fact or if it was actually based on sort of political bias or sort of a difference of opinion. So this sort of shifts into the internet era and sort of kind of the focal point of my research. So the reason why I wanted to kind of give you this background into South Korea's press is because I think it sets the stage for how South Korea's press operates in the internet scale, because you see that after the proliferation of democracy in South Korea in 1987, you have a huge influx of different press outlets that come to be in South Korea. And so specific to that, you actually had a lot of chaebol kind of get in the game of media organizations. So to name a few, you actually had the Gyeongang newspaper was sponsored by Hana, which is a chaebol conglomerate. Muna was sponsored by Hyundai, and the Korean Herald was actually sponsored by Daewoo, which is a chaebol conglomerate. So you had, with the proliferation of democracy, you had a lot of different news organizations trying to get a piece of the pie and sort of oversaturate the Korean media market. And then again, with the proliferation of the internet and technology in South Korea in the late 1990s, you then again have a proliferation of news and media, but this time it's more liberal, it's more left-leaning. For example, you have Oh My News Impression, which are more left-leaning, reformist online news organizations come to be and sort of fill the gap of sort of mainstream media that's either conservative or left-leaning. So it's important to note here as well is that these small news organizations come from not family-oriented, chaebol, hierarchical-like establishments, but are ordinary people. For instance, the Oh My News founder, Oh Yeon-ho, was just a simple journalist who was part of the liberal magazine Ma in 2000. And so you can kind of see the power of the internet in South Korea and the dissemination of media in the 2000 parliamentary election. So with the 2000 parliamentary election, you had the online publication of CAGE, Citizens Alliance for the 2000 general election, which was a publication that essentially detailed a list of over 85 officials that were suggested to be blacklisted because of their dalliances with corruption and scandals prior to this 2000 parliamentary election. And so, as you can kind of tell, this slant was definitely more pro-liberal and ultimately was successful with the proliferation of more liberal candidates winning in this particular election. And then 2002, this again was successful for the more liberal base. In that 2002, Do Mu-hyun won the presidential election. And you again see this tactic of the internet helping to mobilize liberal young political people, and you had a left-leaning media internet newspaper base that was helping to sort of disseminate information in that particular path. But then in 2007, with the election of Lee Myung-bak, a conservative president, you sort of see a switch in this. And this sort of comes because paralleling the growth of sort of left-leaning Korean online newspapers in the late 1990s, you have the growth again of conservative independent online newspapers such as Dailian and Free Zone News. And so with this growth of conservative opinion, you see sort of again this parallel of an oversaturation of a new market of media. And then in addition to this, you had the big three that I mentioned earlier, kind of after the 2002 election, the embarrassment of trying to support a conservative candidate but not be successful, then comes forward and is very aggressively trying to enter into the internet media base and establishes websites and becomes very savvy with the internet. And you see then as a result, in 2007, you have the successful election of Myung-bak. So I just wanted to show you this particular slide. I made this with Excel, so it's so beautiful, I know. But so Freedom House is essentially a nonprofit organization that monitors sort of the freedomness, if you will, of an individual country. So there's different metrics they can look at: civil society, freedom of the press, etc. And they can do an overall rating as well. So I specifically just made a chart or a graph that is specifically looking at the measurement of freedom of the press in South Korea from 2002 to 2017. So Lee Myung-bak became president in 2008, but as you can see, you have a shift from blue to red. So blue indicates a wholly free press. So that means that under Freedom House is considered completely free. And then you see a shift sort of following 2010 into red, and red indicates that it is partially free. So it's sort of shocking, for I think some to see South Korea, even though the numbers aren't that different, there's still definitely a gap between wholly free and partially free press, and that can be shocking for some to think that South Korea, which has been a democracy and is considered to have a thriving economy, to in some instances to not have a wholly free press. So I thought that would just be kind of interesting to show. And so I just wanted to go over sort of key takeaways from a lot of information about sort of historical context of South Korea, South Korea's press. So to look specifically at the role of the press, it's very strongly shaped by the relationship it had with government and the government rules and regulations that were put upon the press. So for instance, you have the defamation law, which is within the Korean Constitution, and it essentially encourages self-censorship amongst press journalists to try not to say something that could be perceived as defamation and then be cause for them to be sued or for the company to be sued. In addition to that, you also have the national security law, which according to Amnesty International, actually from 2008 to 2013, had numbers of cases increasing from 46 to 129 cases. So for those of you who might not remember, the national security law was specifically looking at accusations, usually by the government, that individuals or entities were sort of supporting or purporting North Korean rhetoric. And so this is definitely a concern, obviously, because there's not really any form of regulating this. And so as you can see, there was an upspike in these particular cases with regards to national security law. And in addition to this, you have this sort of perceived concept of economic development eclipsing political and social freedoms, especially during the Park Chung-hee and the Chun Doo-won era, where people were sort of prioritizing economic, at least from the press perspective, prioritizing economic perspective and prosperity over political and social freedoms. And then finally, in addition, you have the embedded nature of the press in the powerful institutions such as government and these economic entities of chaebol, such as Samsung, Hyundai, LG, etc., So essentially then you have, to tie it all up then, the proliferation of the internet sort of opened the press up to non-mainstream liberal and conservative perspectives. And to some I think that definitely is a very positive thing, to be able to be engaged with opinions outside the mainstream. But I do want to leave you with a question that will hopefully be answered in the next set of slides, but if you're a very small press organization, then how do you differentiate yourself if you're competing with a large organization such as the 조선일보 or the 동아일보? How do you, get readership, and how do you get clicks and views on your website? And that's an important question that will be answered briefly. So I did want to just kind of show you something interesting. So I personally consider a lot of these press conglomerates to have chaebol-like nature, and in that you have a very familial transference of power. So if you see the top picture is JTBC, which is a subsidiary under 중앙일보, the Chungang Media Group, which is actually held under Samsung. And if you see the names in blue, so for those of you who are sitting in the back, you don't have to be able to read it, but just the names in blue are essentially the family members that are related to running the Chungang Media Group. So as you can see, it's very familial, right? And then you see that again belly with below with the 조선일보, with the names in red, those are again family members who are involved with the running of the Chosun newspaper. So I just kind of wanted to show that to sort of illustrate that with these mainstream media groups, you have a sense of an investment in a political view that is conservative, but in addition to that, you also have a sort of familial, hierarchical perspective as well. Okay, Naver News. So I don't know if probably all of you know what Naver is and have used it, but I just kind of wanted to illustrate how Naver works to kind of give you insight into the functioning of Korea Press and to sort of illustrate the problem I mentioned earlier of, okay, you're a small organization, how do I differentiate myself and how do I get those clicks and those views to make my newspaper, my online organization more substantial? And the answer is to, have article titles or to have information that can essentially kind of be sensationalized or has a means to get those clicks and views and popularity. And the Naver organizational practice actually kind of encourages that. So if you see the first, does this have a live hiding? Oh, it's okay. I'll point. So the very top picture is sort of the main Naver news page. And so as you can see in the far right, you have it organized by topic. So you have 정치, which is politics, and then economics, social issues, you have cultural issues, world issues, and IT or tech issues. And if you look at, there's a ranking, 1 to 10, and they're all titles. And this is all done by an algorithm that essentially is looking at popularity, clicks, views, engagement. So, if you're a small media organization, the only way you could really maybe get those clicks and those views is if you have maybe a really sensational title or a really shocking article that would be able to encourage people to want to click on your article in competition with these big media conglomerates. Okay. So with that all said, with all that information packed in your brains, I want to kind of move into my next portion of my research, which is looking at the two events, the sinking of the MV Sewol and the 2018 Inter-Korean Summit, with a specific look at the examination of internet media bias as a case study. So why did I choose these two events? I think that they definitely sort of embody sort of important issues that South Korea has been grappling with, with the prioritization of human rights, with the sinking of the MV Sewol, as well as the complicated history of North Korea and South Korean relations. So some background for maybe those of you who might not be familiar with the exact events of the sinking of MV Sewol. So on April 16th in 2014, 8:55, you had the first distress call that was reached out to talk that discussed the ferry had turned and was starting to sink. And then 9:35 a.m. you had the Coast Guard arrive to help. And then 11:18 you have MV Sewol has sunk. And it's important to note that for a lot of articles that were sort of coming out in real time about this, that there actually was a lot of confusion over how many people were saved, who was actually all right and not. Because when I was initially reading, you see people announce like, oh, all 300 people are safe, this is fine, everything's all right. And so it kind of suggests that there was a lot of confusion over who was on the ground and who was reporting accurately, who was reporting true information. And so this continues to be a very difficult topic, and that I can talk more about in the next slide. But then you have on April 20th, 2014, the bodies are recovered of 302 missing, and of which 250 were high school students. And then May 23rd, 2014, you have the manhunt for Yu Byung-eun, and Yu Byung-eun was the owner of the sort of Sewol Ferry company. He's sort of a controversial figure. He actually was the head of a cult and also the head of a subsidiary press organization as well. But he was actually found dead later in June and sort of died of assuming suicide. And then in November 11, 2014, you have the captain of Sewol sentenced to 36 years in prison. So this is, just a summary of some key events, but obviously this is still an ongoing issue. The families are still, seeking some sort of formal closure, even though apparently the yellow tents have been taken down as well. So it'll be interesting to see how things progress moving forward, especially with the upcoming anniversary in April. But I wanted to just talk a little bit about the sort of press reaction to Sewol. So a sort of a phrase that I noticed was a shiche pari, which is, shiche means a body or corpse, and then pari is the parida, to sell. So when using this phrase, it's sort of referring to the press's prioritization of the sort of sensationalism of trying to sensationalize the specifics of these events and the sort of tragedy of the families, instead of maybe looking at the responsibilities or looking at specific means for which, why did this happen, etc. Actually, I was talking to somebody who was a documentarian for a documentary about the sinking of MV Sewol, and he told me that there were even cases where members of the press were hiding in bathrooms and trying to overhear, conversations between members of the family. And so I think that sort of emphasizes there was kind of a dogged focus. Obviously not all of the press members, but there were a lot of press members who were very invested in trying to maybe sell their article or trying to move forward this sort of sensationalism in order to, get that click, get that ad revenue. Which is unfortunate, because then you sort of see an emphasis on fixation for sort of sensational stories, as opposed to maybe looking at the responsibility of, why did this happen and who's to be truly responsible. So looking at the 2018, the first inter-Korean summit between Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un. So it was April 27th, which is actually my birthday, April 27th, 2018. And it was essentially President Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un met at the DMZ for talks that stressed a strong relationship between North and South Korea, and that became the Panmunjom Declaration. And essentially, there's nothing really formally stated, but it was just sort of encouraging positive peace relationships between the two countries. And so the press reaction, I think, as you probably would understand, because South and North Korea have a very fraught and complicated relationship, was pretty mixed. You had, people addressing Moon Jae-in as sort of a spiritual successor to Kim Dae-jung and his Sunshine Policy, and trying to sort of fulfill that particular role. You also had sort of the fanning of the flames of a growing right-wing organization. So maybe for some of you that know, the Taeguki protesters sort of became more of a mainstream concept after the impeachment of Park Geun-hye in 2017. But this definitely aggravated them, because essentially in the beginning they were mainly fanning the flames of anger and, about the injustice that they felt had happened to former President Park Geun-hye, but then now shifting to sort of being anti-Moon Jae-in, anti-North Korean relationships, as well as trying to sort of accuse Moon of focusing too much on sort of international issues, connections with North Korea, as opposed to more domestic policies. So this definitely sort of polarized that particular dynamic as well. And it's also interesting to note that there was sort of a demographic divide as well, right? So I think, talking about North and South Korean relations is really complicated, because there's a generation of Koreans that, lived during the Korean War and have a very fraught dynamic with North Korea. but then, with the younger generation, maybe there's less of a connection there, in that there was, they don't have a physical memory of that particular instance, and so there's also the complication in terms of demographic differences between the two. So in terms of further study, so as I sort of laid out the sort of press interactions and the reactions of these particular events, I kind of wanted to look at this from more of a quantitative perspective as well, because I think it's all good. It's all well and good to read these articles, but to maybe try to quantitatively look at how we can sort of assess the emotional media bias that existed when covering these these events. And so I'm interested in trying to do maybe a data analysis of the events using R, which is a program to glean the most common words used in articles from a range of online newspapers. And so I'd be interested in kind of looking at kind of a broad range of perspectives. So 조선일보, 중앙일보, 오마이뉴스, which is more left-leaning, as I mentioned earlier, Dalian, or a more right-leaning online newspaper, and then 한겨레, which is more mainstream, left-wing newspaper, to sort of get a diverse perspective. And so what I'd be hoping to achieve is to try to see, in these different newspaper avenues, what sort of exists in terms of emotional language. Are they trying to, for each event, are they trying to tap into more sensational verbiage as opposed to maybe talking mainly about facts? And also looking at, does there a connection between, maybe sensational titles or sensational content and Facebook shares, Naver shares, Kakao shares, Twitter shares, etc. And in addition to this, I'd be interested in looking at sort of the market of South Korean media and how it sort of created a culture of prioritizing clicks over facts, as I mentioned, with sort of a tendency to want to create more sensational news. And looking into the effects of the internet on South Korean culture as well as media, so I might be potentially interested in looking into how media has played a role in the Me Too protests that were starting to become mainstream in 2016 and still definitely have a presence here in South Korea today. Okay. And so just to sort of sum everything up with conclusions, with my study and looking at the contextual background of South Korea's press history, I definitely feel that the internet gives a space for players that do not have to be chaebol and have these vast and very powerful, long-standing connections with economic and institutional players in South Korea's government in order to disseminate information. But this definitely comes with pros and cons. You have the opportunity on the internet to be able to interact with a lot of different facts and opinions, but then you also have the proliferation of misinformation or scandals, or the word is it's like fake news and that sort of thing, just like falsehoods that are not accurate or not accurately portraying the event that's being discussed. And so in this sort of crowded internet space, the main way to attract clicks is to create an eye-catching title and use sensational language, which then sort of causes detriments to the parties that are being talked about and can sometimes even encourage misinformation. And so then, this is still an ongoing project, but I've been really excited with what I've been able to research and really honored with the opportunity to, be sponsored by the Fulbright grant to be able to do this sort of work. So thank you so much for listening to me talk for 45 minutes. Does anyone have any questions before you get free fruit and sandwiches?
I have two things. First, just a suggestion on your graph of the Freedom House press rankings. I think it would be good to specify that a higher score indicates less press freedom.
Oh, sorry. I'm so sorry. I forget to mention that?
Yeah, and I know you made the graph in Excel, and I know that's it's horrible to deal with that. But just a suggestion. And my other question is, how are you defining sensational and sensational language?
Absolutely. I think that it definitely can be approached from the lens of looking at how is topic being talked about. I think that there is definitely a language that exists that can be more matter of fact and very factual. Factual is not a word. Very matter of fact and very to the point, versus language that maybe is more flowery or more descriptive, if that makes sense. This is something I'm still developing, but there's a program on R that essentially creates a word cloud, which is looking at words that are used most often. So a one word that is used maybe 100 times in a series of articles would be very large, and so it'd be interesting to see sort of what words are used the most when describing these particular events.
So just a suggestion, it's very interesting. My name's Howard. I was wondering if you have thought about bringing in more general perspectives from media studies. For instance, just one of several examples. Chomsky and Herman's classical work on manufacturing consent, I would think would be relevant to this, not only in that the manipulation of the press by the more repressive governments were aimed to manufacture consent, some seems, and yet there are elements of it that actually contradict that,
Right.
Especially in terms of social movements. So I guess I was just wondering if you thought of bringing this work more in line with positions in media studies.
No, so I think that's a really good suggestion. I might actually ask you after the talk if I could break down the name of the book you recommended. I come from a background of Asian studies and economics, so I'm not as familiar with media studies, so I definitely appreciate any suggestions for any more theoretical basis for the work I'm doing. So no, I actually hadn't thought about that, but thank you so much for the suggestion. I'll definitely take that into account as I continue my research.
Do you have any plans to look at not just the articles, but also the comments? Because knowing how visual comments play in online culture and news consumption in Korea, and the whole drinking scandal which revolved around the manipulation of comments.
Right. No, that's a really good question, and I actually, in my data set, I'm including the most liked comment and the most disliked comment. So I think that I can maybe play with that later. I'm trying to just make sure that as I was mentioning earlier, the sort of word cloud and the sort of connection between maybe more sensational language with shares is working all right, but I think that'd definitely be a good thing to look into as well, because from what I've seen, some of the comments, the comment threads can get pretty wild, so it's an interesting thing to look at for sure.
Kind of related to that, I'm curious if you have been following the K-pop scandal happening with me and the Burning Sun Club, and how the media is, especially in Korea, is talking about that scandal, because there's, as a follower of K-pop and Korean media, I think there's a big difference between international and Korean coverage, so I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how that's unfolding.
No, it's been really interesting because my consumption of that has been primarily just on Twitter, and so I follow some Korean Twitter and some American or just international Twitter. And it's definitely interesting because, you had a lot of K-pop fans that maybe didn't know that there were a lot of deeper scandals that were associated with this particular thing. It wasn't just, Seungmi from Big Bang. It was, there was a suppression of this murder of these 4 women, the hiding of the Gangnam police chief, and this mysterious death of an investigative journalist that was happening. So there definitely was a lot of moving parts that I think international media coverage didn't really give it, and I think that that's really interesting. And I think this is something I kind of forgot to mention in my presentation, but I think with the moving toward the 21st century is you have, as Korea is kind of entering into more global coverage, you have a lot more eyes on Korea, right? And you have a lot of people that are commenting on this particular issue with maybe a lack of a deeper understanding for all the different ramifications and all the moving parts that exist for the Burning Sun scandal. So to answer your question, I have been kind of following cursorily. I'd be really interested in maybe trying to maybe incorporate it as maybe a conclusion and sort of seeing how Korean internet is kind of going in the direction with press. But I haven't formally been looking at it with after specific scope though. But I think that's a really interesting suggestion though.
I've heard that Korean media or news are usually very biased with males and for example rape cases and things like that. And the Burning Sun is part of that, right? But I heard way before about how whenever something happens, usually the news try to write it in a way that people think, oh, it was the women's fault. Like, I don't know if you researched that.
I haven't been formally reading any articles that have touched upon Me Too yet. But I mean, I definitely can maybe see that perspective coming into play. I think that, you know, gender dynamics in South Korea are very complicated. And, you know, I can definitely see maybe some of that coming into play in reporting as well.
To kind of follow up on this comment back here,
is there any way you can incorporate into your analysis online communities that are maybe not hosted on these news websites? Like, for example, I know there's the really super kind of really super anti-feminist website called Yeah. So is there any space for that in your research for tracking the influence of that, of groups like that?
So I actually was considering including, in addition to those mainstream, or more mainstream-ish websites, in addition trying to include the McGallion and the debate, just kind of really, you know, different sort of
those are polar opposites.
Right. But
Yeah.
I guess for me, I was just a little bit concerned with like understanding the internet slang, because
Right.
it's kind of different than kind of like normal
it's-
newspaper and everything. And I can definitely read Korean, but that's like a level of
Yeah,
understanding
yeah.
that I'm not sure I could quite be able to do in the next few months.
Can
But
sympathize.
yeah, but I definitely think it's like an interesting idea, because you have a lot of online communities that will definitely comment on, you know, these articles, but a lot of their kind of conversations are kind of on this completely different platform, and sort of encouraging sort of a radicalization of difference in mindset. So I think that's definitely like an important point to look at for sure. So thank you so much for coming today. I hope you enjoyed the refreshments in the back. Thank you so much.